Okay, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Welcome, whoever you are. Thanks for listening today. I'm coming to you from the quietude of North Garden, Virginia. I have been here for the last 5 days. Regular listeners might remember from last week. I have taken some time off over the last several days. And it's amazing what even just a few days off can do for you. This time last week, I was completely overwhelmed. If you listened to that outro last week, it got away from me in many regards. I was trying to pretend that I had it together, but I definitely didn't. It sometimes gets away from you, doesn't it? And having the last few days to set aside teaching responsibilities or even creative projects and just focusing on myself and grounding in what brought me to yoga in the first place, the observed experience of this life's wonder. It shifts it. It's amazing to me how I can be in the same exact situation, and one day it feels like horrible, and another day not so much. And don't get me wrong, I still think we're like totally fucked beyond words on all levels. But I'm not fretting. I'm not fretting in the same way about it. You know, I'm more at peace with even all of these wrongs and injustices and hypocrisies. I just don't think it's wise or useful of me to expend my limited resources on playing into the dynamics of separation and polarization. So, I don't exactly know what that means. I'm still working it out in my mind, and I've been doing some writing. I hope to get some writing done, and it looks like I really have, and I'll be happy to put that out as soon as it's finished. And in any case, regardless of whatever it is we're angry at, or whoever it is that we think is to blame, or however powerless we are in the face of macrocosmic forces of domination and harm, we can still be good people. We can still be an embodiment of the values that we hold, even if our societies aren't reflecting that right now, even if they never do. Oh, yes, my friends, having a few days away from it all to just practice and care for yourself and your family and lick wounds and not watch news. It's a good thing to do. Don't feel guilty about doing it if you get the chance. Speaking of which, I don't know how much opportunities people have these days for such largesse. I'm lucky that I've had this few days to get my mind in a better way. I've been talking to people, and it just seems like yet again all the cards are up in the air. I should mention that my guest today, Eliana Moreira, she is in Florida, and we recorded this several weeks ago, And the news was not quite the same about Florida at that time. Even just a few weeks ago, it wasn't the same situation that we hear about now. So I feel like I should mention that here because I don't want anyone to think that Eliana and I were being insensitive to what's going on. But things are changing rapidly, are they not? I am very happy to be bringing you this conversation with Eliana today. We have been in some dialogue and practice together since early on in the pandemic, and we've had a lot of different conversations in my teacher's class, and we've had email exchanges, and she's just someone who I have gotten to know some and appreciated her perspective on things. It was lovely to take this moment to compare notes on where we're at and where the yoga world's at and what's important to us about practice. I think that there's a lot to be enjoyed in it today, and I'm again happy to be sharing it with you. Before we get to that real quick, I do want to take a moment to show a little love to our podcast premium subscribers. Specifically today, I would like to thank Jenna Galassi and Nicholas Smith. Thank you, Jenna and Nicola. Appreciate you. And, in the last few days, meditating on stuff, I was thinking about, like, the podcast and, I don't do this podcast for money at all. I really don't. I do it just for my own learning and process and sharing and like a small, desperate attempt to connect with people. And, at the same time, it takes quite a bit of work to do it. I didn't teach any of my classes this week or do any of my regular Zoom calls. I canceled everything, gave myself this time off, but I still left doing this, editing the podcast and recording these intros and outros for the show this week. That's the only work I've done this week. And I mentioned last week that my producer tried to talk me out of it, and I didn't take his advice because I don't think of it as work, I enjoy it as I do my teaching, and even less so than the teaching because it's just me talking with people that I enjoy talking to, or just me having fun with this microphone in my hand like I'm doing right now. It feels like less work than my regular teaching stuff that I do, but I have to admit that it is some work. I've had to depart from the other activities that my family and people are doing today so I could have this time. And frankly, I need money to survive. So for whatever it's worth, we developed this podcast premium subscription as a way for people to support the show, as well as have access to the archive. The last year, the most recent 52 episodes are always free, but there's another 200 plus episodes in the archives that is quite a resource. And so if you want to have access to that, or again, you just want to support the show, becoming a podcast premium subscriber is the way to do it. It's choose your rate. You can cancel at any time. And if you don't have any money and you really want to listen to some of those older episodes, all you have to do is email us. We'll totally hook you up with a free account. But if you are in a position to give a little something, it makes a difference. And I'm really grateful to the people who make that gesture. So thank you to whoever you are. If you want to find out about becoming a podcast premium subscriber or any of my stuff, my classes and online stuff, and hopefully we'll come together and have in-person events at some point. If you want to find out about any and all of my stuff, go to jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all. I think that's it. I will touch base with you on the other side, but let's go ahead and listen to this conversation that I had with my friend Eliana Moreira. Hello?
Hello.
Eliana.
Hey.
What's going on? How you doing this morning?
I'm doing all right. It's a little hectic over here in Miami, but I'm still all right. How are you?
I'm okay. Honestly, I had trouble getting to sleep last night, which hasn't happened in a long time for me. I used to struggle with insomnia in the past quite a bit, but it hasn't been an issue in a long time. But last night I had trouble getting to sleep.
Oh, I feel you. I've had that this week as well. Actually,
I think it was partially a conversation I had with my wife on like pandemic stuff before she went to bed, and that like triggered me. But then it was like a whole sometimes in the past when it happened, I was not in a family. I wasn't like a husband and a father yet, and I would just use it and stay up all night and do creative shit or whatever.
Yeah.
But nowadays I'm like, oh no, I got to talk to Eliana in the morning. I got to get to sleep.
I feel you.
Yeah, but what about
So
you?
what do you do when that happens? Do you kind of just lie there, or do you breathe? Like, how do you work with it?
I do both of those things. I mean, sometimes breathing, I can breathe. And it's interesting when you say that. There's like, I can't do like Ujjayi pranayama. That'll like keep me up. And it's almost like I've come to identify like what is the sleeping breath pattern or something. There's a way to make my breath happen that simulates the way my breath is when I'm sleeping. And that's what helps me fall asleep.
Wow. I like that.
Yeah. Well, in any case, enough about my sleeping patterns. You're in Miami, and you said it's hectic. Were you referring to the fact that building collapsed or whatever? Like I've been seeing everything in the news.
Yeah. Well, there's that. Absolutely. But there's also like an exodus of people moving to Miami and Florida right now. I think because of the pandemic, obviously. So it's just, there's so many people here. And it's just, and this is, considered low season. It's hurricane season. So it's usually a lot of the people aren't actually here. But it's just packed. It's full.
And
people.
Where were you coming from? Where were you before you got to Miami just now?
Okay. So before Miami, I was in California.
Right.
So I was living around Orange County area between San Diego and LA.
Sure.
And we were in complete lockdown there. So I was, hanging out with you a lot on teachers' classes.
On Zoom meetings.
And doing a lot of yoga on Zoom. And then all of a sudden here I am, and Miami's very much alive and awake and not very closed down at all. So it was a little bit of a culture shock.
Yeah. Well, I guess, LA did open up, right? Or that part of the world did open up, but you had already left. But it must be a switch. And it is interesting to know. Not everyone who's in a place that was fully locked down necessarily has a sense that there were places that didn't lock down the same.
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
And that's weird. It's political too, right? Is there a lot of politics in the air? Are there people? I guess people are moving there because they want to go there because they've got easier restrictions, maybe.
Yeah, easier restrictions. Also, the prices are pretty good, although they were. But now, of course, with everybody moving here, the prices are going back up on everything. But, I think the cost of living here was a little less. And yeah, there's less restrictions. And, Miami is sort of known for its, obviously the beautiful weather, the beaches, and it's a fun city. It's very alive. People are awake. It's not quite like New York City, but people are awake, pretty much all hours of the day here, having a good time. Yeah, I'm sure there's various reasons why they came.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Have you spent time there before in the past?
Yes. So my mom lives here. Okay. And I lived here for about 3 years before I moved to California. And before that, I was in New York City. And before that, I grew up in New Jersey.
Oh,
so
all right.
I've been to a bunch of, exactly.
See, that makes sense. That's why we have connected some, because we both grew up West Coast and then spent most of my adulthood on the East Coast. We know both flavors.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And I grew up in that New York City yoga scene, in the 90s and then, all of that. So I was really much over there. So I knew a lot of the same places you grew up in, with Jivamukti, and I spent time in Iyengar studios over there, a lot of different spaces over there.
Oh, see, I didn't even really realize that you grew up adjacent to that. So, yeah. All right. So it's interesting to me because you and I have had many conversations over the last year. Mm-hmm. And now we're having this conversation for the show and we're recording and we know that. And it's sort of like, oh, what am I going to talk to Eliana about? What can I talk to Eliana about? But I think I'm curious about is we didn't know each other at all before the pandemic, right?
Yeah. Well, I knew about you, but yeah, we didn't really know each other. I hadn't really connected yet. Yeah. Mm. And I've been listening to your show for quite a while before that.
Oh, okay. Okay, good. But I don't know. I recognized that it seemed to me you had an inside view on what I saw sort of like the last vestiges of the yoga celebrity thing. Mm-hmm. Like maybe there's still yoga celebrity, but I don't know. I don't see like new yoga celebrities being created in the way that they were in the past. Mm-hmm. Right now, I don't see that happening at all. And I got a little bit of it because I brushed up against it. And sometimes people think I'm more of like an A-lister teacher when I never have been really. I've always been kind of like a B-lister, which is fine by me. And I learned that when I traveled in the last 2 years. I just don't have the same kind of draw as like that group, There was a group, and I remember when I talked with Jason Crandall, he was sort of one of the lasts in my mind. Maybe I'm wrong about this. But in any case, you got to see a glimpse of that. And part of this show, if not one of the big parts of this show, and the way that I've tried to do it, was about trying to show the real deal about what happens with yoga teachers and who they are. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I just feel like you and I have connected on that reality on like, there's the hype around yoga and yoga teachers. And then we actually have gotten to see what it actually looks like on the ground when people are like traveling around and trying to get from gig to gig or whatever.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say about it.
Yes. And I only say that as like an overarching something that I have connected with you on, and I think this conversation will be about some. But we should go back first, because I didn't really realize that you grew up in New Jersey, or that you were privy to the New York scene that I fell into in the 90s. So where were you in the early, mid 90s in relationship to yoga?
So my family's from Brazil. I think you know that, right? Mm-hmm. So my dad moved us out here when I was a baby. And before I even got into yoga, I was into dance and music and singing and all that. And I hadn't really found what I called like my language, what I felt was really resonated. And then when I was about 17 years old, I fell upon the book Be Here Now by Ram Dass, of course, quintessential book of, I guess, the spiritual community back in the day. And it was a really interesting book, but what I really liked in that book was at the end, he had all this information about yoga and meditation. And at that point in time, I was 17 years old, and, it's that age when everyone's getting involved with like drinking and drugs and all kinds of stuff. And I remember him talking about, consciousness and getting high, but that, to really sustain some sort of experience of what we want to talk about, elation or higher consciousness, would really be by the practices of things like yoga and meditation. So that really piqued my curiosity. And the next day I literally went to an Iyengar yoga class, and this was in New Jersey. So I started in New Jersey in an Iyengar yoga studio, and it was a small studio. And it was great. I just, honestly, my first class, I had a really deep experience when we did Supta Padangusthasana, and when we brought our leg back down, it was like I felt like my leg fell through the earth, and I was like, something's going on here. Like, what is happening? You know, my whole experience of my body mind had shifted, and I hadn't quite felt anything quite like that with dance or singing or anything. So I got really interested in this yoga, you know, and my father, he's now passed, but my father was one of those, he never went to school. He's like the American dream, like literally came here from Brazil, busted his butt and just did amazing things. And he always taught me to read. He was like a big reader. And he said, if there's anything that I can pass on to you in this life, I want you to be a reader. So I started just reading a ton of books on yoga. I mean, like everything I could put my hands on. And really, you know, started that self-study, which I didn't even realize was, you know, a thing in yoga until I started reading about it.
Like the thing, maybe?
Yeah, exactly. Right. So I started doing that. And then I started, you know, exploring teachers. And as much as I loved Iyengar, I also love that there were like all these different styles and all this different stuff. And, you know, I was 45 minutes away from New York City. So, and I used to drive into the city to go study, you know, Martha Graham or Limon Institute or Alvin Ailey. You know, I was a dancer. So I was like, why not go into the city and study all this other yoga? So I went to Dharma Mitra. I went to Jivamukti. I went to, I can't even, you know, remember.
So we might have
honestly.
taken class together and we didn't know.
Perhaps. I went to, you know, Yoga Union and Allison West. I mean, I took classes everywhere. I was, you know, I just soaked it up. I was just so in love with it and just wanted to learn everything. And I started to understand at that point in time that there were so many different tools and techniques, and that they all not everything resonated, but always something resonated. Does that make sense? So I would take a class and like maybe 60% of what was being offered would resonate, but you know, the 40% I could sort of let go of. And this would be in every single class or style. So it was hard for me to feel like I could, you know, sort of marry myself or commit myself to any one yoga style, because I just felt there was so much depth and just great stuff in all of them. And they all worked for me at different times for different reasons, whether it was some sort of a breathing that I had learned or some new way to move into, you know, a form, or some new language that someone had offered that created an interesting visualization, or, you know, Kundalini yoga, you know, I just thought was really interesting energetically. There was some, you know, so there was always something that I could take. And I remember my Iyengar yoga teacher at the time really wanting me to focus on one thing. And, you know, she was sort of like, you should try and find one path. And I was very much like that young, you know, yoga student that was like, but all paths lead to the same place. Like, why do I have to pick
Isn't
one
that what
path?
it says? Yes. Well,
So
you know what?
really
Let me
hard.
say something. It's very interesting to me to hear you say that, because I definitely had the same experience in terms of, oh, there's like 60% of this that I think is amazing. And then there's this part that I don't really care for, but I'll just go for this 60% and then I'll go to a bunch of different classes. I think a bunch of people did that. And that is what led to all the hybriding, because there was like that Iyengar teacher telling you to do one thing was basically saying you should study Iyengar. Like that at one time you chose one, and there was like a tradition of that thing that you would then do. But around that time when you were going to classes and I was going to classes, it was that first time people were kind of going to yoga more a la carte or something.
Yeah, exactly.
And we were taking what we liked from it. And
Exactly.
I mean, and it's interesting because then there's purists who'd say, oh, you see, that's the appropriation. But I don't know about that. I just think that there were things that were useful and things that weren't useful.
Well, that's where I would disagree with this appropriation idea, because if we go back to, like, I always go back to Krishnamacharya. Like, Krishnamacharya taught, we ended up with Iyengar, Desikachar, and Pattabhi Jois kind of creating these huge lineages. But it was because Krishnamacharya taught each one of them uniquely and bio-individually, right? So to me, that's really what it's about. So why not fill myself up with a knowledge of tools and ideas of yoga so that when I come face to face with a student, or even with myself at a different phase in life, I have the ability to customize a practice that's actually going to suit me at that time or suit that student at the time. And everybody needs different things. You know, some people get really anxious when they do Nadi Shodhana. Some people get super relaxed when they do Nadi Shodhana. So, right. So like, we can't assume that certain things work in specific ways for everybody. And that was really my thinking behind the more that I started to integrate all these different tools. It was like, okay, I need to look at myself, and I need to look at every single being that comes into my class with me or into space with me, that they're this holistic, you know, individual. And Krishnamacharya like knew what he was. If that's really, if the stories are true about how he approached yoga, or this idea that yoga is really meant for the individual, then that's really, to me, it makes perfect sense.
Even if the stories are not true, it's still a good idea. And yeah, and I don't know. And I think that, again, I think that is what Desikachar was teaching people. And I think both of us are singing that same song, that idea that it fits to the person doesn't have to fit to it. Mm-hmm. And then the more tools you have to help figure out what's the most appropriate and helpful thing to be doing, is sort of the name of the game in terms of being a yoga teacher. So when does that start to happen for you? When do you start to teach? Do you do training? Where does your first training? When does that happen? Mm-hmm.
So I started doing sort of like informal training apprenticeships with various different teachers. And then I did my first yoga teacher. I was actually going to school to get my doctorate in art history. I wanted to teach Latin American colonial art and architecture. Completely different like game. But
no wonder why you like to study with Allison.
Exactly. And I love metaphors that have to do with art and architecture. But so I was doing that, and then 2 years into that program, I just realized that I didn't want to sit in a library all day long. And I just was doing so much yoga, and I thought, okay, if I'm really going to devote my life to studying something, as much as I love art and architecture, I really love yoga more. So I kind of left that program. I was a little bit of a dropout. My parents were not happy about it. And I was like, okay, I'm dropping out. I'm not getting my doctorate, and I'm going to be a yoga teacher.
Oh, no, they did not like that.
No, they didn't. I totally did that. And so then I went over to New York City, and honestly, I just found a teacher training at the time that I could afford that had a mixture of Iyengar, Desikachar, and Ashtanga, because I figured I wanted something a little bit more, you know, integrative and not completely devoted to just one style. So I was lucky, and I found that at a place called Yoga Effects. It no longer exists, but at the time the director was wonderful. Shout out to Liz Menderano. She was just a fabulous first training teacher for me. And it was great. It was my first teacher training. It was the 200-hour. At the same time, I was still doing different apprenticeships, mostly in Iyengar yoga at the time. But then when I completed my teacher training in New Jersey, the fad in the area was the Bikram yoga. So it was like really hard to get a gig or a job or a position where you were teaching, you know, the sort of yoga that you speak about, that I'm speaking about. You really. And I was young. I was like in my early 20s, and I really didn't know much about, you know, hot yoga or Bikram yoga at the time. And I knew nothing about Ayurveda, which this really, you know, is what brought my love for Ayurveda after I had this experience. But I started teaching a lot of hot yoga classes. So I was teaching like 3 or 4 hot yoga classes a day. In my 20s, I was waitressing on the side as well. And I was getting, you know, I'm by nature a very fiery pitta, Prakriti or dominant. So all this fire increasing. And then one day I just started vomiting blood, like so bad when I was teaching. I was rushed to the hospital.
While you were teaching?
While I was teaching.
Oh my God.
I basically had to put them with their legs, you know, in Viparita Karani on a wall. And I was like, I'm going to run to the restroom. Ran to the restroom, just started vomiting like so much blood and couldn't believe it. Came back, finished the class, of course, and then got in the car, called my mom, rushed myself to the emergency room, and found out that half of my esophagus was basically gone. So much heat had basically, my body had basically, they claim, like eaten half of my esophagus. There's a
like
term for this.
Acid reflux thing, you mean? Like
beyond acid reflux, though. It's like, their first question was like, are you a serious alcoholic? And I was like, no, because mostly people like in their very, very old age that are severe alcoholics usually get this. And so I started to notice that it was the heat. And that's when I began to study Ayurveda, because I realized that something was up. Like this wasn't going to be sustainable for me to teach hot yoga classes all the time. And also I don't want to speak negatively about hot yoga, because I know sometimes it brings people in the door. But I found for me that it was just overstimulating. There was all this music, there was all this heat, and the ability to really, sort of down regulate, get into your breath. There's the mirrors, and just, the reality of just overheating your body. And most of us that were attracted to hot yoga are mostly Pitta personalities, and it's not really the wisest sustainable practice for us. So,
well, in fairness, you were in your 20s, and I burned the candle at both ends in my 20s, as it sounds like you did too. So I'm sure there was like lots of factors that led, like you couldn't put it all on the hot yoga, but I know what you mean. Like the point I get from it is that not all yoga practice is the same. So when you read articles about how yoga is good for this or yoga is good for that, depending on who you are, going to a hot yoga class is not necessarily going to get you what that scientific study said about how it helps reduce stress, depending. Exactly.
So, I stopped that, and then I tried to find that's when I started to try and find the right spaces for myself. But in the midst of that, I was still studying with a bunch of different teachers and going around and studying with different teachers and having some, like, sort of what the overarching theme we brought up early on, having some really interesting and challenging experiences with teachers and teachers' personalities, teachers' egos, teachers. And so that's when I really, really had to go through some painful experiences. And Kali, the goddess Kali, is one of my favorite goddesses to chant to and to reflect on, because she reminds me of how the perverse is also sacred, and how a lot of the lessons I personally have been about being able to sort of embrace the harder, the darker sides of what it means to be human. And to realize that our teachers they're just teachers. They're just human beings who've maybe done a bit more practice before us, who've learned a little more wisdom before us, and try and take what works, take the teachings and try and let go of the teachers. So that was a big, big lesson for me early on, that continued into, I would say, even my 30s. I was accepted to go study in Pune with BKS Iyengar right before he passed away. And I actually turned it down because of, honestly, just some of the experiences that was happening. I was noticing that in some classes that were related to that lineage, that my nervous system was getting constantly triggered and agitated, and just knew in my heart that it wasn't really the right thing to do. And that's when I went to Minnesota and I met Dr. Timothy McCall, and I started doing yoga therapy.
Before you go and meet Timothy, I'm curious about what you just said about declining the invitation to go to Pune and the triggering of your nervous system. My question is, do you think that was like inherent to the method and the way the techniques are taught? Or do you think that was like personalities and like power abuses, or both?
It's hard to say, because I'll tell you this, as coming from a Brazilian culture, there's so much similarity in sort of like my Latino Brazilian culture that I see in Indian culture. So there's certain ways in which I think things are done and said culturally that I sort of got but I'm not sure if somehow there was some kind of a misunderstanding in how some people maybe understood how the method was being transmitted through. And I don't know if I guess I'm trying to say, I don't know if it was a cultural misunderstanding or what, but what I directly experienced was I had experiences where I was being yelled at, where aggressive energy was brought towards me, where it felt like there was just some, narcissistic tendencies and sort of mimicry of trying to mimic what I think some folks thought was really, almost like they were trying to be, like BKS Iyengar or, I want to watch what I say because I truly don't want to offend anybody, but that was my direct experience, was just a lot of, it just felt, there were moments where it was very hostile. A lot of conversation about people being abused sexually, physically. I had about 4 different occasions with teachers where they weren't to the level of, high level of abuse, but they were definitely inappropriate moments. And so all of that in combination just made me think that perhaps I needed to not go. And I'm not sure, who knows? Perhaps it wasn't the right decision, but it was the decision I made at the time based on what I knew then and based on, my own teacher, my own main teacher had been, she had claimed that she had been raped by a teacher of hers. A few women that I knew had made claims. A lot of women who I knew who had gone to Pune had said, be careful, you're very sensitive, like it might not be right for you. So, again, a lot of it was hearsay, but a lot of hearsay. And then a lot of it was my own direct experience with just really challenging moments that I personally just felt like, why is this even here in the yoga world? Like this doesn't really make sense to me. And I'm okay with, tough love. That's what I was trying to say. That was sort of the connection I was trying to make with Brazilian culture and Indian culture. Like, I'm all right with tough love.
Is that like a misogyny that you're referring to, or just like when you say,
yeah, there was a misogyny. There was just an arrogance. Like, for example, I actually went to a class recently and I wasn't even asked, and I was adjusted in ways that were very technical, but clearly not right for my body. And so what I felt was that I wasn't being seen as an individual. I was being seen as a form, and the form wasn't fitting the picture that it needed to fit.
See, but that's the technique part. You see, what you were talking about before in terms of like the abuses and people being raped, like that's not about like the method's technique. That's like people's power abuses or whatever. But just now, when you referred to what happened in class, nobody like raped you, but they came up and adjusted your body in a way that was technical and not in relationship to you as a person. And that's the part of the technique I'm curious about, because I talk to some people and they love Iyengar yoga and they talk about how somatic inquiry there is inside of it. But my experience was more like what you were saying. And I don't know if that's changed in Iyengar classes. I haven't been in a long time, but you're saying you went recently and it still happened the same.
Right. And the somatic inquiry I loved. And that's the 60% that I've taken from it. You get what I'm saying? So like from
so
my
the
original
40%
teacher,
is them coming over and adjusting you.
Exactly. At least in my experience, because I mean, there's so much that I still teach that comes from, my sort of background, my foundation with my original teacher, who was Iyengar based. But she wasn't like that. She was a holistic Iyengar teacher. So not every Iyengar teacher, I think, obviously is like that. So that's where we have to talk about the method and the people. So she was able to really, she had her stuff too. I'm not gonna lie. That relationship was very challenging. We kind of had a little breakup, but
wait a second. We don't have to go into it, but is that like that thing that sometimes happens where you sort of like apprentice with someone for a while, but then at a certain point, it's time for you to fly on your own. And there's that little weird thing where sometimes the teachers are either better or worse at letting you become an equal.
Yeah, basically. And a lot of it honestly came down to money. I was apprenticing and teaching and working my bum off and just really not getting paid what I thought was fair. And, and starting to value myself, but also not like crazy, just regular value, pay me what I deserve. And I went and opened up my own studio, and, there's just difficulty in negotiating that. And
sure. You opened a place in New Jersey?
I opened a place in New Jersey. So I had my own studio in New Jersey. Yeah.
I didn't know that. And how long did you have that?
So I had that for, about 4.5 years. My dad actually was the one who invested in it. And the reason we closed it down was because he passed away. And I'm an only baby, and I didn't want my mom and I to kind of use what my dad had left for my mom to keep building the studio, because as you know, it takes a while for a studio to like.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.